The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once famously proclaimed that one must still have chaos within oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star. And in this video, we'll be exploring a form of chaos that dwells inside of, well, maybe not all of us, but at least some of us. And its name is the Trickster Archetype. That's a topic that was suggested by a viewer whose name I will probably mispronounce. Amaliadeus. Hopefully one of those two is correct. Anyhow, Amaliadeus wants me to talk first about what the Trickster Archetype is, and then about why our world needs it. I suspect that he, or possibly she, always hard to tell on the internet, asked about that because I spoke a little bit about the Trickster Archetype in my last video on soul work and psychopomps. In that video, I suggested that people like comedians, fools, tricksters, shamans, and visionaries actually function as deliverers of our souls, especially insofar as they help us expand the outer limits of our consciousness and perceptual fields. And along the way, they help what is small and deficient in us wither and die off, which in turn delivers us to the shore of our deeper possibilities in life. But at this point, let's delve into the first part of Amaliadeus' question by taking a brief look at what the Trickster Archetype actually is, especially for those of us who aren't too familiar with that kind of language. But if you already have a pretty good handle on it, you might want to skip to the timestamp I'll put down below at the bottom of the screen, which is where we'll take up the second, probably more interesting part of Amaliadeus' question. Okay, all right, so since you evidently have not skipped ahead, let's start with defining what an archetype is. First, within regular English usage, and then, more specifically, within Jungian psychology. Webster's defines an archetype generally as a perfect example of something, and then more expansively as the original pattern or model of which all things of the same type are representations or copies, which would be a definition much more in keeping with the word's classical Greek etymology. But here's the thing, I was also pleased to discover that Webster's now includes a more specifically Jungian definition, which is an inherited idea or mode of thought in the psychology of Carl Gustav Jung that is derived from the experience of the race and is present in the unconscious of the individual. For the most part, that latter definition is the one we'll be using in this video, so let's expand on it a little bit. Carl Jung was an early protege of Freud, but who deviated from an orthodox Freudian understanding of the unconscious in several important ways. One of which was to conceive it in terms of what he called a collective unconscious. In other words, a reservoir of themes and images that he called archetypes and that run through a culture and its ancestral past. These archetypes are often expressed through a culture's prevailing mythology. That is, through the narratives and stories that help us find orientation and direction in the world, and which also structure our individual unconscious to a large extent. So one way of thinking about the Jungian unconscious would be that it's much more culturally, historically, and collectively structured than Freud's was. Hence the phrase, the collective unconscious. I know, right? Anyhow, some examples of Jungian archetypes would be the mother and father archetypes, the hero archetype, the artist-creator archetype, the seducer archetype, the wise sage archetype, and of course, the trickster archetype, which is often represented by figures like jokers, fools, clowns, madmen, comedians, etc. Basically characters who defy sober, rational sensibility in favor of laughter, playfulness, and shape-shifting deception. And at this point, we should probably also mention Joseph Campbell, who perhaps more than anyone else helped popularize the idea of understanding things in archetypal and mythological terms. One of his principal contributions was to popularize the idea of the so-called monomyth, which has to do with how archetypal images run across cultural boundaries and ultimately coalesce into the collective unconscious of humanity itself, in the form of mythological themes that are common to pretty much every culture's mythology. Anyhow, Joseph Campbell was also famous for popularizing something called the hero's journey. I bet you've heard of that, which has to do with how the hero archetype can emerge in us when we have to go through many difficult trials and reversals, an experience that can eventually make us more heroic ourselves, which is a powerful motif you can see in movies like Star Wars and The Matrix, which themselves might be considered some of our modern quasi-mythological narratives. Okay, so now that we have a rough and approximate understanding of what archetypes are, especially from a Jungian perspective, let's look more specifically at the Trickster archetype and why our world needs it. One place we can easily catch sight of the Trickster archetype, along with a number of other archetypal themes, would be in the realm of cartomancy, and more specifically in the major arcana of the tarot. And although there are many different types of tarot deck in our world these days, I'll try to keep things simple by referring to the classical Rider-Waite deck, where the major arcana consist of 22 out of 78 cards. And some of the archetypal themes that appear on those 22 cards would be the Magician, the Hermit, the Hanged Man, and the High Priestess. However, since we're talking about the Trickster archetype, let's focus on card number 0, which is the Fool, who is traditionally represented as a blithe, winsome figure who's just about to step off the edge of a high cliff. Of course, on the surface, that would seem to be an illustration of self-destructive stupidity. However, as with most cards in the tarot, its symbolism isn't quite that simple. In fact, the Fool's deeper divinatory meaning has to do with liminality, or perhaps more accurately, transliminality. In other words, with encountering and passing beyond established boundaries and constraints. With the perilous figurative precipices along whose edges we're all traveling, and over which we sometimes step. So, from that point of view, the Fool is about exceeding the limits of things like conventional thinking, habits, and values, or about what it is to move beyond the tight confines of obedience and conformity that end up governing a lot of our lives. And it's the Fool's great and noble art to pass beyond those sorts of constraints and to seek out the further reaches of our shared human adventure, which, of course, usually looks like sheer stupidity from a more practical and pedestrian point of view. And to illustrate that idea further, let's make note of another short epigram from Nietzsche, who famously proclaimed that those who were dancing were thought mad by those who could not hear the music. Those who were dancing were thought mad by those who could not hear the music. I'm repeating it to you to give you a few seconds to think about it. And at this point, I'd say that anyone who's ever given anything truly luminous and great to this world, anyone who's cared that much and who's suffered that much as a consequence, did so because they kept dancing, because they could hear the music even when everyone else in the world couldn't. All of the Albert Einsteins and Vincent van Goghs and Edgar Allan Poes of the world, they all somehow managed to keep dancing, perhaps compelled by the irresistible cadence of life's deeper possibilities, sounding like thunder in their ears and carrying them far beyond the outermost pale of orthodoxy and safety. An example. You know, it used to be considered common knowledge that only a fool would ever dream of heavier-than-air flight for human beings. But now our skies are filled with it, because a few madmen kept dancing and were willing to step forward toward the outermost edge of that dizzying promontory, and then over it, regardless of consequences. And then, suspended for a slow-motion instant above the abyss of their possible annihilation, they suddenly discovered that they could spread their wings and ascend into the firmament, not only for themselves, but for the rest of humanity too. The musician Frank Zappa once put it pretty succinctly, "Without deviation, there is no progress." In other words, the Trickster's great transliminal art has a lot to do with the animating spirit of creativity, with exceeding the boundaries of what's already here and bringing something new into the world. And I suppose that all of that would constitute the first answer to Amalaiadios' original question, which has to do with why the world needs the Trickster archetype. It's because without those eccentric fools, madmen, and comical souls who are willing to deviate from all of the ways that life has been preordained for us, our world knows very little creativity and very little progress. And without those things, it won't move very far toward fulfilling its ultimate destiny. And neither will we. And speaking of transliminality and deviation, at this point it would probably be a good idea to make note of the fact that tricksters are often protean shapeshifters. One good example of that would be Loki of Norse mythology, who not only changed his/her sex pretty often, but at various points in the myth transformed into different types of animals, a horse, a fish, a bug, for instance. And here we find another attribute of the trickster archetype, which would be a defiance of constancy and predictability, which makes it very difficult to contain or control tricksters. For instance, it's very difficult to shame tricksters or to make them feel guilty or otherwise bad about themselves. For the most part, they're immune to those sorts of manipulation, and that in turn makes them pretty much inimical to the more dictatorial side of our human nature. In fact, I'd say that any sort of dictator archetype would be the exact opposite of the trickster archetype, or perhaps more accurately, its repressed shadow side. So a second reason why the trickster archetype is important to our world is because when a society is ruled mostly by dictatorial impulses, by all of our overweening juvenile desires to control other people and to dictate what thoughts, feelings, and values and linguistic practices are appropriate for them, well, that's a very pathetic and impoverished world indeed. Basically, a world that's well on its way to becoming as dissolute and despotic as any of the 20th century's totalitarian disasters. But I guess on the other hand, that may be mostly a matter of opinion, and I'm sure that there are still plenty of wannabe dictators who would be pretty quick to disagree with it. After all, the Soviet Union was a pretty cushy place for Stalin, right? And for all of the well-heeled apparatchiks of the Soviet socialist system, it was only a genocidal living hell and nightmare for pretty much everyone else. Anyhow, another related part of the puzzle would have to do with the relationship between the trickster archetype and wisdom, which, by the way, I'd also say resists being constrained and controlled by the dictatorial mentality. But here I'd like to refer not to Nietzsche or Frank Zappa, but to the poet William Blake, who, with his usual piquancy, famously proclaimed that if the fool would persist in his folly, he would become wise. Similarly, it's often fools and jesters that appear in Shakespeare's plays who end up delivering a lot of their real wisdom. For example, consider the character of Touchstone in As You Like It, or perhaps less obviously, Polonius in Hamlet. Or, to update the example a bit, think about the allure of stand-up comedy in our own age, whose practitioners sometimes manage to expand our consciousness in perceptual fields. That's mainly because comedians are some of the few souls left in our world who are still allowed to give voice to uncomfortable, offensive truths, and who occasionally offer us some real wisdom in the process. And as I said in my last video, that's mostly because we don't take them very seriously. And because of that, we're able to laugh. And while we're laughing, their wisdom has a chance to fly beneath the radar screen of our possible ideological objections, so that it can affect us at a more immediate and visceral level. If we're able to let that happen, which of course isn't always the case in our world today. Anyhow, as a consequence, comedians are generally allowed to give voice to forbidden truths that pretty much everyone else knows, but that none of us can say out loud. And I suspect that our laughter at those sorts of moments is at least partially an expression of relief. It's almost like we're thinking to ourselves, well, thank God someone had the balls to say it. Probably we wish it were ourselves, but at least someone. And that automatically relieves us of some of the loneliness and alienation that are all too easy to feel in today's world. In other words, it's not so much that comedy expresses things that we just haven't noticed before, although that certainly happens. More to the point, it's about giving voice to things that we know all too well, but that are prohibited by our world's ideological taboos and censorship. In essence, it reminds us of the greater wisdom that already lies somewhere hidden in our being. That almost childlike capacity to name the truth directly and forthrightly, because as Confucius once famously observed, the beginning of all wisdom is to call things by their proper names. Or to make the same point from a slightly different perspective, the source of the trickster's wisdom has to do with the fact that the trickiness of the trickster is really just a reflection of the trickiness of life itself, an expression of its inherent elusiveness and its paradoxical nature. Its mystery and its magic, ceaselessly unfolding and evolving over time. And from that perspective, calling things by their proper name is really about learning to treat life as it actually is. About absorbing the lesson that chaos and discord have their essential place within the larger ambit of things, and that they're actually bearers of a kind of beauty, not our enemies, any more than their exact opposites are our enemies. And so I'd say that a third reason why our world needs the trickster archetype would have to do with how it invites us to do exactly that, to call things by their proper names, and to recognize and honor the disorderly side of life as we know it, and hence to lay claim to some measure of wisdom in the process. And if you're still not convinced of that, well, consider whether wisdom would even be wisdom if it knows nothing of the trickster, if it stubbornly insists on remaining blind to the charms of foolishness and laughter and playfulness and contradiction. Personally, I don't think that's wisdom. And in fact, I'd say that at that point, what we're calling wisdom is probably little more than someone's self-serving agenda in disguise. Basically, just another tedious, deadening expression of the dictatorial mindset. The truth is that wisdom that doesn't know laughter isn't actually wisdom in the first place, and it's not even close to being worthy of our veneration. And finally, I'd like to explore a fourth possible answer to Amaleadeus's original question by way of a wonderful little book on game theory by James Carse, and it's called, maybe some of you know it, finite and infinite games, which I'd highly recommend. Anyhow, according to Karst, there are ultimately two types of games in this world. First, there are finite games, which are structured around winning and losing and are hence competitive in nature, and that usually involve a corresponding degree of seriousness. And then there are infinite games, which have no rigidly defined structure, and which have to do with simply enjoying the more playful and childlike side of our nature. Basically, the side that's more in alignment with the trickster archetype than with seriousness. An example. I'd hazard to say that for most professional players, basketball is very much a finite game. It's almost entirely structured around who wins and who loses, all of which is taken pretty seriously. For the most part, professional basketball players aren't there to have fun. They're there to win and to make money in the process. On the other hand, I'd say that playing hacky sack with your friends in the backyard is usually an infinite game. It's not so much about determining winners and losers according to rigidly defined rules, but about, well, just having fun. About playing just to play. Of course, we human beings are endlessly inventive when it comes to turning infinite games into finite ones. And so I'm pretty sure that there's such a thing as serious competitive hacky sack somewhere in our world. But it's hardly ever about that, is it? And at this point, it's probably already becoming increasingly obvious that we can easily extend that metaphor to the larger domain of life. Some of us see life mostly in terms of winning and being regarded by other people as winners, or at least not as losers. Basically, for some of us, life is about competing for superiority within our world's dominance hierarchies, which is usually supposed to be a very serious business. As the saying goes, he who dies with the most toys wins. And you can see that same basic competitive paradigm at work in large sectors of our world these days. In business, in politics, in what's come to be known as the sexual marketplace, and many other places too. On the other hand, some of us think that life is mostly about having a good time, about enjoying the journey of human existence, and we're consequently not inclined to take things too seriously, mostly because we're not too preoccupied with winning and losing in the first place, or with things like posturing as if we're some sort of alpha, or with collecting the most toys so we can think of ourselves as winners when we die. Woohoo! Oh, and by the way, side note, I once saw a t-shirt that said, "He who dies with the most toys still dies," which I thought was a really funny way of seeing things more from the perspective of infinite games. But I digress. Anyhow, the point I'm trying to make, what is the point I'm trying to make? My point is that a fourth reason why the trickster archetype is important to our world has to do with how it enhances and deepens our lives, especially by inviting us to let go of a lot of our debilitating self-seriousness and self-importance, and along with it, our egoistic desperation to see ourselves as winners relative to other people. After all, here's the punchline when you think about it. Isn't it true that we're all losers in the end? Especially since we all eventually lose in the most basic contest of them all, which of course is the struggle to keep from dying. All right, so before I bum you out too much, let's take a moment to summarize. As I see it, there are 4 principal reasons why the trickster archetype, broadly speaking, is important. The first would be that any sort of meaningful progress in our world depends upon people who embody enough of the trickster archetype to be able to pass beyond our world's prevailing conventions and habits and open up new creative possibilities for the human race. The second would be that honoring the trickster archetype can help us resist the kinds of tyrannical dictatorial impulses that ultimately just degrade our world and make it less worth living in the first place. The third would be that at the same time, the trickster archetype can lead us toward life's greater wisdom, at least if we let it, especially by teaching us to honor the more chaotic and unpredictable side of life and to call things by their proper names with an almost childlike directness and honesty. And finally, the fourth would be that the trickster archetype enhances our actual enjoyment of life, especially by inviting us to let go of a lot of our overweening self-importance, which in turn helps us become players of life's infinite game, rather than centering our lives on winning and losing, along with the whole toxic miasma of self-seriousness. And I guess that at this point, I'd like to move toward ending this video on what may be a more personal note. And I don't know about you, but I personally feel a great sense of kinship with the Fool in the Tarot, as I do with most people who treat life as an infinite game. In fact, I often think that what's going on in our lives is that we're all participating in the telling of a great big cosmic joke that's woven into the warp and woof of the entire universe, into the grand turning of the stars at night, as well as into our own very fleeting and fragile existence. And what life is really asking of us is to see if we can start to get that joke, to learn to laugh at it, or better yet, laugh along with it. After all, when you think about it, there's something pretty comical about our existential predicament, isn't there? You know, to be alive in this universe in human form, fraught as it is with its many absurdities and raging contradictions. And I think at that point, the next thing that life is asking of us is to see if we can start to tell some small part of the great cosmic joke ourselves, to add something to it, something that wouldn't be there if we weren't here. And that's a real challenge, because if we're honest about it, every single one of us is a bearer of slights and sorrows, of injuries and injustices, and heartbreaking tragedies too. And the longer we live, the more of them we accumulate over time. In the end, we all know what it is to bear the wound, the terrible blood wound of life. And so there's really no shame in our pain and suffering, not even for a second. And there's absolutely no shame in feeling defeated and demoralized by what we've been through either. But on the other hand, it takes real fortitude and real vision to learn how to laugh. To laugh with a clear recognition of all of the reasons we have not to. It takes an abiding intrepidity to find delight in what we're experiencing, rather than to see ourselves as constantly oppressed and cheated and victimized by life. It takes the better part of who and what we are. And perhaps at the end of the day, that would be my fifth and final answer to Amale Adeos. One of these days I'm going to get that. That would be my fifth and final answer to Amale Adeos' question. The world needs the trickster archetype because sometimes when the moment is right, its wisdom brings out the more noble part of our nature. The part capable of remaining fundamentally sanguine about life, despite its many vicissitudes and painful reversals. The part of us that's capable of enjoying the unbridled adventure of it, and of feeling real gratitude for our opportunity to experience it. But, hey, that's just me. And as always, your own mileage may vary. Anyhow, thanks as always for listening. I hope I wasn't too serious in a video about the Trickster archetype. But if I was, well, maybe even that is ultimately just another expression of the trickster's love of contradiction. And anyhow, I have faith that you will be able to find it in your heart to forgive me, even if it's a bit of a struggle. But in any case, yes. Thank you once again for your time and attention. And of course, as always, take care of your soul.